Hi, welcome to our webinar. We are very happy that we have that many subscriptions, and that's why we moved over here to YouTube. And today we will talk about, as promised, about Angular 15, which is quite new, isn't it? I'm not alone today. I have two nice colleagues, namely Michael. Hello, Michael.
Hello, nice to meet you all. Hi.
And below here we have Rainer. Hello, Rainer.
Hello, Manfred. Hello, Michael. Hello to everybody else. Hi.
Rainer, what will you tell us today about Angular 15?
Yeah, so my part will be about the NgOptimizedImage directive. So it will be more or less, how should I say, you will see a lot of images, so a little bit funny, not so much theory. It will, of course, be very short. It will be a little bit short, let's put it like this, but definitely interesting. So.
Awesome. And Michael, what have you prepared for us?
Great. Yeah, thanks. I will talk about host directives, one of the nice APIs that Angular 15 brought to us. So quite an enabler again for generic implementations that allows us to implement quite nice generic patterns, and also about guards, functional guards that we can introduce with Angular 15 as well. So yeah, I guess this will be interesting too.
Awesome. By the way, we are going to do 3 Q&As during today's webinar. So feel free to ask your questions here in the chat, and we will pick them up after each of those parts. And I will start with something I've prepared for you, namely with Standalone APIs, the little brother, the little sister of standalone components. I'm really excited about them. You should see my slides by now. Do you see them by now?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. So let's get started. The thing is, standalone APIs already arrived with Angular 14.2, and now we got some additional ones with Angular 15. But first of all, let's start with a little metaphor. Perhaps you know this game here. It's a nice game, a funny game. It's about pulling out the bricks without destroying the whole tower. And if you ask me, the Angular team is really great when it comes to this game, because they do it on a regular basis. Think about Ivy, for instance. With Ivy, they switched out the whole compiler and the whole runtime underneath the covers, and even though everything still works, even in a better way. And now they just did it again. They did it again with standalone components, which allow us to make ng modules optional. We don't need any ng modules anymore since last summer. This feature arrived with Angular 14 as a developer preview. The idea is to just set this standalone flag to true and to import everything the component needs to live. The so-called compilation context. Everything the compiler needs to accept in the template of this very component. The compilation context, or as I call it, the neighborhood. So the thing is, defining this neighborhood might be a bit exhausting, but I have a good solution for defining this neighborhood, this imports array, for you in some minutes. But before we look into this, let's have a look at what we gain from going with standalone components. The big gain is that we just need TypeScript modules. We don't need any Angular modules anymore. That means our source code is a bit more direct. There are less indirections in there. Plus, it is easier to reason about. We don't have to think across the corners in order to find out what the source code is doing. So it is more direct, it is easier. We don't need to type that much. And also, this makes Angular easier to learn. If you think about possible new colleagues that will enforce your team, then this also helps them to get started with Angular. And the good message is those standalone components are out of developer preview since about half a week, since Angular 15 shipped. How cool is that? That means now you can officially get started with standalone components in your huge projects. Feel free to install Angular 15 and to use them. And we get some bonuses. One bonus is we get standalone APIs. The thing is, we need such APIs to make use of libraries without any ng modules. Because now, as we don't have any ng modules anymore, we cannot import them. And so we cannot import other modules. So we need another API for this. And when introducing those APIs, the Angular team and hopefully also other library vendors decided to improve what they have. That means we get some new features, some new possibilities as a byproduct of standalone components and APIs. How cool is that? Yeah, and this is what I want to tell you about today in my first part before my colleagues take over. I've basically prepared 3 things for you. The first thing is about standalone components in general, to get everyone into the boat. Then we will talk about standalone APIs for the router and for NGRX, something that already landed with Angular 14.2 at the end of the summer with Angular 14.2. And then we will look into the standalone APIs for the HttpClient. And this comes with some great new possibilities, like a new kind of interceptors and a new way of chaining interceptors together. There's also a little tiny pitfall in there. I will also talk about this pitfall. Before we get started, let me also introduce myself. I am Manfred. I am a trainer and consultant for Angular, and I'm focusing on Angular for enterprise scale applications. For this, I'm doing a lot of workshops and consulting. I'm also quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. That's why I have this accent, you know. I do a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the globe, which is quite easy nowadays because we are all used to using remote technologies like this one here. Okay, so let's get started with the first thing I've prepared for you. It's about standalone components in general, as mentioned, to get everyone into the boat. As you have seen before, standalone components are all about just setting the standalone flag to true and about importing the compilation context directly into the component. This makes the component more self-sufficient. This allows the component to live a bit more on its own, to not depend on any context that is around the component, contexts that are defined by this or that imported module. And as mentioned before, it's a bit exhausting to define this compilation context by hand, to write this imports array by hand. And that's why I'm very happy that Dylan from the Angular team announced about a month ago, it's meanwhile a bit more than a month, that he is working on a new feature for the Angular language service. The Angular language service is this little tiny tool that is used by most IDEs. In order to get Angular support. It's used by VS Code, for instance. There is a plugin for Sublime Text. There is also a plugin and adoption of this for WebStorm and IntelliJ. And what he told us is, well, if you start using a component in your template, then you will get this quick fix that will automatically add this component to this imports array. Dylan showcased this with an inline template, but obviously this will also work with a more traditional separate HTML file with a separate template. And this is cool because this really makes standalone components drop dead easy to use. By the way, most of the times we talk about standalone components, but to be honest, there is also such a thing as a standalone pipe. If we want to make ng modules optional, we also need standalone pipes, and this is also about pipes with a standalone flag. And we have the same with directives, Plus, if we want to use pipes, directives, or components in the template of another component, we need to import all of them, which is in the future done automatically by the feature Dylan is working on. Plus, now we can bootstrap a component. We can just take a standalone component, which could still have the name app component, and bootstrap it. How nice is that? That means we don't need this indirection, this unnecessary indirection from a bootstrap method to an app module, down to a bootstrap array, to an app component. No, we just point to our app component. This is what I meant when I told you all of this is removing unnecessary indirections. Plus, when bootstrapping our app component, we can provide some providers. Those are the providers you use to put in your Ng module. Global providers, providers for your root scope. Providers that give you all the services you need to use this or that library. Could be an Angular library, could be a library from a third-party vendor. In order to get started quickly, there is this bridging function, import providers from. It allows you to work with legacy modules, with existing code. This is a very important message because this shows that the new world of standalone components bridges over to the existing world of Ng modules. Hence, no need to throw away your existing source code. No need to rewrite everything. No, you can bridge over to the existing world. Everything works needlessly together. Needlessly, you know what I mean. Seamlessly, yeah, seamlessly together. Hopefully not needlessly. So this allows you, for instance, to grab the services from the HttpClient module and also the services from the router module. Saying this is also where standalone APIs come in. While we will see this bridging function in the beginning quite often, we will see it less and less in the future because more and more libraries will provide their own standalone APIs with convenience functions that replace this line of code. We will see a provide router function in some seconds. Saying this, the Angular team really wants to encourage you to use provided in root instead of this providers array. You should prefer provided in root. It's a bit less obtrusive. However, there are situations where you really need this providers array. Situations where you want to pass in some configuration to the services, like your app routes. And in those situations, you really need this style of programming, this providers array. In all the other situations, for instance, when just setting up a global service, provided in root would be a better choice. So please keep this in mind. By the way, we also have some new flags for the CLI. You can now generate a standalone component with ---- standalone, and you can do the same with directives and pipes. Something we don't have yet is an ng-new with a standalone option. The Angular team will work on this, but currently this is not possible. If you ng-new up a new project nowadays, you will get an app module. Of course, you can delete it. This is what I'm doing quite a lot in the last weeks. And then you can start working with standalone components, but you don't get it by default. And there is a reason for this. While writing the schematics for this is not that difficult, it would influence existing libraries. Because a lot of existing libraries like Angular Material or NGRX or other stuff have schematics used for ng-add. And you can guess what those schematics are doing. They are searching for an app module because their goal is to hook them into the app module, to import themselves into this app module. And if we would go without an app module, those existing libraries would fail. They wouldn't fail at runtime, but they would fail when you try to do ng-add. Of course, you can npm install them by hand and use the bridging function, but those code generators for ng-add assume an app module. And so they are a bit reluctant to migrate ng-new now. However, they are working on this. And in the near future, we will also get some standalone flag. It's not sure if it will just be minus standalone or another syntax, but you will get the possibility to scaffold a new Angular application with standalone in mind. Okay, that sounds pretty amazing if you ask me. Let me show you all of this in action. For this, I've prepared a little tiny example. This one here. In this example, I'm using Angular material just to prove that we can bridge over to the world of existing modules. I'm also using NgRx for the same reason. And as always in our workshops, all of this is about searching for flights. If we are lucky, we can even find some flights. And it's also about dealing with your tickets and the next flights. So nothing I would call home about. However, this example is complex enough to show all the concepts I want to show you today. Let's have a look into the source code. If we look into the source code, perhaps we start with the main DS. We see here this bootstrap function, which tells us we can now directly bootstrap. Let's make this a bit bigger. We can now directly bootstrap our app component, which is a standalone component. Plus here we can provide global providers. Here I'm already using the Standalone API for the HttpClient, the brand new Standalone API that landed half a week ago with Angular 15. I'm also doing the same here with the router. Here we also have a Standalone API that takes the routes. And I'm doing the same with the store with NgRx, which was also upgraded for this standalone API thing. And if you look closely here, you already see a naming pattern. This naming pattern did not occur by incidence. This is something the Angular team envisioned. They told us, well, functions to set up the providers for a library should start with provide in order to tell us which functions to use. We, as the developers, just need to look up such a function in a newly installed library, use it here, and Bob's your uncle. But more about this in a second. Before we look into those standalone APIs, let's have a look into our app component. As you see here, it's just about a component. And here I need to import the compilation context. The compilation context, which consists of other standalone components, perhaps even other standalone pipes and directives, and existing modules that I want to use inside of this component. And one more time, this allows us to bridge over to the world of existing code. So no need to rewrite your code, or as Microsoft expressed it once in a conference about 10 years ago, they told us this sentence about 50 times: your investments are safe. By the way, also the router is now refactored so that all the parts of the router can be directly imported. All the parts like the router outlet or router link or router link active, or perhaps even ngIf and ng4 or the async pipe and so on and so forth. We can directly import it, and we are lucky that the Angular language service will do this automatically for us in the future. So no need to import the whole router module or the whole common module. Would be possible, but normally you would prefer this more fine-grained way of working especially because it's done automatically for you by the Angular language service in the future. As already mentioned, all of this is super duper back and forwards compatible. You can totally import a module, a pre-existing module, into a standalone component, and vice versa. You can totally import a standalone component into a pre-existing module. And this allows to migrate your huge existing source base with a strategy I call the ostrich strategy. Just stick your head into the sand. There is no need to hurry and worry. You can stick with your existing code base. You don't need to rewrite it immediately. However, you will very likely want to write new stuff with the more modern style with standalone stuff. But you don't need to touch any existing stuff. I think that's a good message. Okay, now let's talk about standalone APIs. Let's get started with the router. When it comes to the router, we could, in theory, bridge over with this bridging function import providers from to the router module. However, meanwhile, we have this provide router function. And here we are passing in the root routes. Plus, we are also passing in some additional features. Also, this is a pattern that comes from the Angular team, and they want us to also use this pattern for our libraries. Those additional functions or features like preloading or debug tracing, there are some additional ones, are activated by passing the result of those functions in here. And this brings a nice side effect, a nice byproduct. Namely, because of this, existing libraries become more tree shakeable. How cool is that? Just as a byproduct of going with standalone stuff, everything becomes more tree shakeable. Your bundles become tinier. Because functions are super tree shakeable. It's quite easy to find out if a function was called or not. And if it was not called, you can throw it out of the bundle and everything the function is using. If it was called, better put everything behind the function into your bundle of questions. Also, this is a naming pattern we will find in other libraries. Perhaps you're wondering what's with lazy loading. Well, the thing is, now as ng modules are gone, for lazy loading, load children can directly point to another routing configuration. And also this feels more natural, because that means you don't need to point from your root roots to a child module defining child roots. No, it's more direct now. You directly point from your root roots to your lazy child roots. This here is another child routing configuration. It really feels natural. It really feels right. And there is a nice add-on that also landed with Angular 15. You can get rid of this projection. If you export your routing configuration via a default export, then you don't need any projection anymore. Also, this makes it shorter. Of course, nothing I would call home about. However, I think that clearly shows that Angular is becoming more lightweight. There are a lot of little tiny improvements that in overall make Angular more lightweight, and I think that's a good message. My only point of criticism here is that currently this is the only place in Angular where default exports are supported. But this is only a tiny point of criticism, and we need to start somewhere, I guess. By the way, you can do the same with standalone components. Now, as an addition for load children, there is a load component flag, and this allows you to lazily load a standalone component. That means now lazy loading can be done in a bit more fine-grained manner. And also here you can get rid of this projection if you export this component as a default export. There is a little tiny add-on, namely if you look into your child roots, you find a new providers array here. Those are the providers you use to put into your lazy modules. As they are gone now, we need another place where we can put those services. And the thing is, if you put a service here, you get an own scope. You get another scope for this route here and all the child route. A new dependency injection scope. And everything in here will be lazy loaded alongside this lazy route. The thing is, you will get a new dependency injection scope regardless if you go with or without lazy loading. Regardless if this route here is directly loaded or not, you get a new DI scope. And this takes away a lot of confusion because in the past, both things have been intermingled. They have been intermingled even though they don't have anything to do with each other. In the past, when you did lazy loading, you always got a new scope. And if you didn't do lazy loading, you never got a new scope. Now lazy loading is decoupled from this here. If you place an providers array here, you get a new scope. Otherwise, you don't get a new scope. So it's also a bit more direct, if you ask me. Fits really nice to this new style of Angular. However, one word of caution, if it is possible, also here the Angular team recommends to go with provided in root. It sounds a bit funny, but even if you have provided in root, the service will be lazy loaded if it is only used in a lazy portion of your application. Yeah, it sounds a bit funny, but this is the case. I did not know this for quite a time either. The Angular team told me, but yeah, this is really the case. So whenever possible, go with provided in root. This providers array is, however, needed for a special case, namely a case where you need to pass in parameters to your libraries, like parameters for an NgRX feature slice or for effects used by this feature slice. By the way, what you see here is already the standalone API for NgRX. You can now use those functions to set up a feature slice for a portion, hopefully a lazy portion of your application. So this is really a great example. This is not that a great example because just a service without parameters can easily be provided in root. Okay, let me show you a demonstration for all of this. Let's get started with the main DS file. Here we already see provide router. I'm passing in the root routes. I'm passing in here the feature for preloading, and I want to use the preload all module strategy. I don't pass in with debug tracing because, yeah, talking that much does not help anyone, so I skip it. Talk less, program more. When we look into our app routes, then we see here another routing configuration. And this routing configuration has some lazy parts. It loads this flight booking area lazily. Flight booking, load children, always as always, but now we don't point to a module. Now we directly point to this or that further routing configuration, or this or that further component we want to lazy load in a fine-grained manner. And as those things are already my default exports, we can get rid of this projection, which also makes our source code a bit easier. Now let's move into flight booking routes. In here, we see that I'm setting up my feature slice using NgRX, and I'm setting something up for the HttpClient, which is the next thing we will talk about. Okay, nice. The future is lightweight. Now let's talk about the HttpClient. I'm really excited about this. The thing is, at first glance, to set up an HTTP client, we have this function here, provide HTTP client. It's following the naming conventions we discussed before. Plus, as with the router, you can now pass in additional features. For instance, you can pass in a feature for interceptors. However, those are not your father's interceptors anymore. Those are new interceptors, namely functional interceptors. So let's compare them to the more traditional ones. Here you see a traditional interceptor that is intercepting each and every HTTP request and response. The traditional interceptors are services. That means we need injectable. We need to implement an interface. We need to tinker a class. We need to import or inject everything into the constructor we need. Plus, we need to implement this intercept method that takes the current request, the next link in our chain, in our interceptor chain. One interceptor can be linked to another interceptor, which can be linked to another one. The last one is delegating to the real HTTP logic, and we get back an observable with an HTTP event. This is the traditional interceptor concept. The new functional interceptors are more lightweight. They just look like this here. It is just a function, a lambda expression with a function taking the request, taking the next link in the chain, and we can use the new inject method or function. It's a function to get stuff via dependency injection. So also here we are going more lightweight. And yeah, this is nothing I would call home about, as mentioned before. But all those things taken together is really cool, because all those things make Angular more lightweight, and also your code, your whole architecture, more lightweight. There is another thing you can do. You can provide another HTTP client for a lazy part of your application. And in this lazy part, you can provide further interceptors. And normally, when you did this, let me look here. Normally, when you did this, then those interceptors in the lazy part of your application have been shadowing the interceptors in the root scope. Some people thought this was a bug. There are a lot of discussions out there at Stack Overflow and at GitHub when it comes to Angular issues, but it was really as intended. The idea was, if you introduce your own interceptors in a lazy portion of the application, you are shadowing the root interceptors. Or to be more precise, the interceptors in the outer scope. It does not necessarily be the root scope, but very likely it's the root scope. That means the interceptors out there are not executed. They are not triggered. You live in your own world, in your own decoupled bubble. This was always the case, also with traditional interceptors. However, now we have this feature that is called with requests made via parent. And if you do this, then the interceptors in the outer scope are called to. So this is new. And this perhaps allows us to align a bit more with the principle of the least surprise. This will also make your root interceptors, your interceptors in the outer scope, be triggered. I have a little tiny drawing for you to visualize this concept. Let's say we have the root scope here. Let's say we have an interceptor here. It was set up for the HTTP client in the root scope. And if our flight service is using this HTTP client, then this outer interceptor obviously will be triggered. It can influence all outgoing requests and all incoming responses. Now we also have a lazy part. This lazy part gets an injector of its own. Officially, this is called the environment injector now. It was the module injector before, but now as we don't have any modules anymore, it's the environment injector. And in here, we also could register an interceptor with the HTTP client. And if a component in there is using the HTTP client, it's also triggering this interceptor. By default, those two areas are decoupled from each other. By default, if I call the client in here, only the inner interceptor is called. However, with this new feature, with requests made via parent, we can also call out. In this case, all the inner interceptors will be called, and then the interceptors of the next level, of the parent level, will be called. And then the interceptors of the parents, and so on and so forth. Looks nice, isn't it? Well, there is one pitfall. There is really one pitfall. Namely, think about using a root scope service in your lazy component. Look at this. I think now already those arrows tell you what's going on and why we have a pitfall. Now, as your inner component is using a root scope service, we are bypassing everything in here because the root scope cannot know about your lazy environment injector scope. It cannot know. It would also be awkward if loading a lazy part would influence the non-lazy parts. So this is really done by intention. But you need to be aware of this. Otherwise, you will have to wonder about this a lot. So please keep this in mind. If you call a outer service, your inner interceptors won't be called. So what are the solutions for this now? Well, we can register services in nested scopes too. No one prevents us from re-registering the flight service in here. In this case, also Bob's your uncle, obviously. However, I don't like this because now I need to think twice and several times where to re-register my services. Another solution might be to just go with one generic root interceptor. Just one interceptor out there. If it is very generic, it can do different things for different URLs. And we could even parameterize it by lazy loading little tiny helper functions from our lazy modules. But still, here we would have one root interceptor and only one root interceptor. Let's have a look into this. When we look into this, we will also start with main. And here we see that we have provide HTTP client here. And I'm also setting up some new functional interceptors. By the way, I also want to use the traditional interceptors. They are called interceptors from the I now, from dependency injection. Those are those old style interceptors that are class-based, that are service-based, and that we need to provide via a multi-provider. If you don't have this legacy stuff, then you can get rid of this and get rid of that and just be happy with your functional interceptors. By the way, I really find it funny. In the beta phase, also during the release candidate phase, this function was called with legacy interceptors. But yeah, perhaps this would cause some stress because legacy means we get rid of it. And so perhaps this was the reason why they renamed this to interceptors from the I. It's a bit less judging. Legacy or from the I think from the I is less judging. Okay, let's have a look into my odd interceptor. This odd interceptor is doing what a lot of interceptors are doing. It is adding some security header to all requests that go to my API. Plus, it writes something to the console so that we can see, okay, our interceptor run. Plus, all of this is just a function. No service, no provider, just a little tiny simple function. Prints out interceptor. Let's go back to our main. Here we also have our legacy interceptor, our interceptor from the eye, which is doing the same, but it's now class-based. We have a service, we have an interface to implement, we have this method, but the implementation is the same. We are adding a security token to all outgoing HTTP headers. Plus, we are also telling the console our legacy interceptor run. Let's go back to the main. If we jump to our app routes, and if we now jump to our lazy flight booking routes, then here we see also provide HTTP client. I'm also setting up an own interceptor, a lazy interceptor for this lazy portion of the application, and I'm setting up with requests made via parent. So first of all, let me comment this out. This will give us the default behavior we also had in the last years, where the inner interceptors shadow the outer ones. Let's click here on Passagier auswählen, which should be called select passenger. And if we look here at the console, we see only the inner interceptor run, only the booking interceptor from the lazy scope run. Default behavior, inner ones shadow outer ones. Now, let's use this new feature with requests made via parent. And now you'll see that first of all, my inner interceptor run, but then all the outer interceptors run too. Plus, at the end, the legacy interceptor, which is also an outer interceptor. This also shows that legacy interceptors come at the end of our chain of responsibility. Okay, cool new feature. However, there is a catch, as mentioned before. Namely here, when it comes to select flights, I'm using a route scope service. And so the interceptor in my lazy portion is bypassed. As you see here, only the two route scope interceptors are called. So please keep this in mind. Otherwise, you will have a hard time. And yeah, this is by intention, because otherwise a lazy part would influence the behavior of non-lazy parts, which would also be quite awkward, wouldn't it? By the way, there is no need for something like this here. If you don't set up another interceptor, you don't need to provide your HTTP client one more time for a lazy route. No, please don't do this, because in this case, as always, as also in the last 6 years, you get the HTTP client from the route scope. Hopefully it's set up there. Normally it is. There are some additional features. If you need JSON-P, I cannot remember when I used JSON-P the last time, then you can add the support for this by passing in this function. Otherwise, it's tree shaking away. And I think most of the times it will be tree shaking away. If you want to switch out the XSRF configuration, you can use this feature here. The thing is, XSRF token handling is on by default, even though if you don't call this function. This function is only there to fine-tune the behavior. But by default, the HTTP client is always looking for a cookie like this, a cookie with this name, and its content is always sent back to the backend using this HTTP header. This happens by default, but if you want to switch out the names of those cookies and headers, you can use this function here. By the way, if you look into the source code, how this feature is implemented, It is just another chain in our chain of responsibility that is made up by our interceptors. It's just another interceptor, an XSRF interceptor or something like this. If you want to turn off your XSRF protection, then you can go with this function. But don't use it together with the former one, because configuring something and turning it off together does not make sense. Normally, you don't need to switch it off because this guy here is doing nothing if it does not find a cookie with this name. But yeah, you can switch it off and perhaps some additional bytes are reshaked away. Okay, so if you like all those topics, then I have another good message for you. We have completely rewritten our Angular architecture workshop to embrace standalone components. So if you want to know how all of this fits into your architecture, there is a renewed workshop on this. We are answering several questions. I just picked up 3 of them. One question is how to use standalone components and APIs for your architecture. Another one is how to implement maintainable architecture with monorepos, standalone components, domain-driven design, and perhaps even an X. And another question is how to implement micro frontends with module federation, standalone components, and web components. For sure, there are more questions answered here, but those are 3 questions that I wanted to show you. We also talk about reactivity, state management patterns, and authentication. All of this is available as a public training. We also do company trainings, and we do it in both ways, remotely and on-site, in German and in English. So let me quickly show you the page for this workshop before we go on with the Q&A and with the other speakers. If you go to Angular Architects.io, you can switch to English here. You can go to workshops, and then here you already see our main workshop, and you see the next public date for the English architecture workshop is in March. However, you can book it as a company workshop too. If you scroll down here, you see the full agenda, plus you see here all the details of the date. There is even a group discount for groups with 3 or more people, and there is an early bird until the end of January. If we switch back to German again, we see the next public German date is in about 3 weeks, in the middle of December. So if you want to join there, please hurry. And also here we have an early bird until the end of this week. So hurry if you want to use it. There is also a group discount for groups with 3 or more people. Okay, cool. Let me come to a conclusion before we move on with our Q&A. We have seen that standalone components are GA now. They are generally available. They are out of developer preview, and that's really cool, isn't it? So feel free to start them now for more lightweight Angular applications. Use them together with all the other cool new stuff. We have also seen for standalone APIs, we have this naming pattern that makes us to quickly find out, well, this is for setting up this library, and this is for adding additional features. This also makes everything more tree-shakeable. When it comes to lazy loading, we can now directly point to our lazy routes. No need for an unnecessary detour via an ng module. And interceptors also allow to be used in nested scopes. We can make sure outer interceptors are called too. And that's it. Here you have my contact data, and if you want, follow me on Twitter to stay in contact. Use Twitter as long it exists. Okay, now I think it's time for a little tiny Q&A. Yeah, this is how I like to explain recursion. You need to understand recursion in order to understand recursion. Yeah. So let me switch off this here and let's have a look at the questions. Boy, we have quite a lot of questions. Are standalone components compatible as web components? Yeah. There is also a new API, a standalone API, that allows you to wrap standalone components as web components. If you ask me, this new API even feels more natural. You can look it up in my blog, in our blog. There is a blog article somewhere about this. Yeah, the good message is this is a great opportunity for the whole Angular team to rethink existing APIs and to make them feel a bit more natural. Please find them now in the chat. Standalone plus web components. Okay, what else did we have? Mikey Owls is asking, you still have to use Angular elements as before with modules? No. You can directly use them now. You cannot go zoneless currently with standalone components. That means you really have to live with zone. You don't need to love it, but you have to live with it. And this will change, I guess, next summer. So the summer of 2023 will be an awesome one. It will hopefully be. No promises. The Angular team does not promise anything when it comes to the timeline. But if I read between the lines correctly, we might get some improvements quite soonish for going zoneless. Provided in root is usually not set by third-party component libraries. It's one of the hardest things to get working for complex DI situations such as MFE architectures. Yeah, so you cannot force third-party vendors to use it. However, they should use it whenever possible because provided in root is more tree-shakeable. Because if you point to something, then it cannot be tree-shakeable. But here we are not pointing to it. We just say provided in root. And this means it will be removed if no one uses it. So why is provided in root preferable? It is a very inexplicit and breaks the pattern of having a feature module which provides certain features and components. Well, the idea is to make everything more tree-shakeable. This is the main idea. And the Angular team, now in retrospect, they don't love the fact that besides components, we have another hierarchy, namely a dependency injection hierarchy. And of course, provided in root does not make this hierarchy go away, but it doesn't make it that obvious. You know, if you cannot get rid of it, wrap it somehow. Don't look into the sausage factory. And as mentioned, it's more tree-shakeable. This was why it was invented in the first place. Another good question, hopefully. With standalone components, we lose NgModule to structure our app folder structure. Is it sufficient to put component from same domain in directories, or do I need to introduce NX into the project? Well, both is possible. In order to structure your application, it is a good idea to have a sound folder structure. And I would say for a smaller application, some people, some months, this would be good enough. If you have a huge application, then I would suggest to go with NX, because NX gives you linting rules. Linting rules that, for instance, prevent that one part of the system can directly access another part of the system. This decouples your domain, your modules, your parts of your front-end application. Yeah. So for future libraries, I would encourage you to go with an X. If it is a tinier application, a good folder structure should be good enough. Using a custom NX plugin generator to scaffold apps and others for standalone is helpful. All the NX benefits do. Yeah, that's right. And we have something like this. Let me quickly show it. It's called Angular Architects DVD, which generates first, I would say, good structure. I say good because nothing in this bad world is perfect, but the first good structure for a huge application. And it also supports standalone components. There is now also since I think 6 months, a standalone flag in there. Has anyone benchmarked the benefits of having this more gradual way of importing Angular directives? Well, the thing is, it will not influence your performance. You might be promised, but technically you are using standalone components all the time. Since Ivy, you are technically using standalone components, because after the Ivy compiler has done its job, you have technically something like standalone components. There are no modules anymore after Ivy is done. What we get now is we get this possibility in the public API surface of Angular. So the answer is no. Your runtime performance will not be influenced. As a side effect of those new APIs, perhaps your bundles will get smaller. And as a little side effect, compilation times might decrease. So compilation times might be a bit better, theoretically. Also, nothing you will call home about, but this is also a topic the Angular team is working on. We will get new, faster bundlers in one of the next releases. Tom is asking, what would be the best practice method then for adding a global shared module that has, say, all Angular material imports? Well, in theory, you could put all the modules in an array and import the whole array. However, one more time, this will destroy tree shakeability, because then the array points to all modules, and so they will be used regardless if they are referenced in your code or not. The bundler will just put them into the bundles. So going with this array workaround, it is possible technically, but the Angular team does not encourage you to use it. It might be okayish if you have two directives that always go together. Two directives that cannot live with each other. We have such directives for Angular forms. We have one directive for the whole form. We have another directive for the input elements, and they really work together. Using them without each other does not make any sense. So in these cases, you could go with an array. You could also stick with modules. But in all other cases, the Angular team wants to encourage you to be more direct. And that's not a big deal, because we will get auto imports quite soonish. Dylan, we've seen it before, is working on it. Can I load standalone components with module federation? And the answer is yes, totally. There is even a blog article in my blog that shows how to use module federation together with standalone. You can use standalone components, or you could just load a router configuration from over there. Both is totally possible. I always say, if it works with lazy loading, it will also work with standalone, with Angular in general, and with module federation. If it works with lazy loading, it will work with module federation. How the singleton of the same service works in between standalone components? Well, it's as currently. Hi, Daniel, by the way. Daniel is a good friend and colleague. We met at NgConf this year, and we had a lot of good conversations. So nice to see you, Daniel. It's as in the past. So just use provided in root, and the service will just be in the root scope. Or register it with a component, and the service will be in a scope for this component and all its child components. So when it comes to this, there is not really a big change. Chris, root providers is very powerful. Yeah, with something like a store, something you need to configure, it's the way to go. Miroslav, should we use import API functions or app initializer? I am not able to find a working example when the app initializer requires some service that are loading configuration from the server beforehand. Well, if you really want to postpone bootstrapping the application, then you need to go with the app initializer. Requires services. Okay. In this case, there is a new concept. I'm not completely sure what you mean, but perhaps you want to look into the concept of the environment initializer. I just wrote it into the chat. But feel free to drop me an example. I'm more than happy to look at the example in order to find out what you are referring to. Yeah, some people like it. Yeah, the demo project will be sent out. I think tomorrow in the morning, I will send out the recordings of today, our slides, and our examples. Yeah, everything becomes lightweight, baby. That's right. And that's cool. Can you please share? Yeah, you will get an email tomorrow. So thanks for the compliments. Would you recommend to be an early adopter? Well, yeah, as currently this is now generally available, I would use standalone components, at least for new stuff. We don't need to hurry with existing code, but I would use it for new stuff. Both concepts will coexist for quite a long time. However, it might be possible that some additional features will show up that are built on top of standalone components. But everything that is here now will still work in the future. Angular is about preventing breaking changes because they did not make that much good experiences with breaking changes. And yeah, this is a good message because Angular is really quite stable. Since we have Angular 2, it was really quite stable. Breaking changes, not really. Also, I haven't seen one. There is also NgOptimizedImage, so this should do the job. Oh yeah. Is it possible to inject a service into a function-based interceptor? Totally. You can go with the inject function. You have seen it in my example. It's just one call to inject, and then you can tell inject which service you want to go with. I think Michael has an example for this in his presentation. Yeah, if you provide a service in different components, then you will get multiple instances. So it's not a singleton anymore, then it will be a twingleton or a tripleton or a quadrupleton. If you want to have just a singleton, then provide it for root scope. Provide it in root or when bootstrapping the application. Or even within your router configuration, but then it's only a singleton within the scope of the lazy portion of your application. Will Angular change a functional paradigm? Well, I would say Angular always was about being polyglot, which means they are using functional things like Rx. When it makes sense, they are using classes. So I think also in the future, it will be polyglot, which is the way to go, if you ask me. Some people overdid OOP and it was bad. Some people overdid functional programming and it was bad. So if you ask me, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. I like to use standalone components as front end for headless CMS. Yeah. Well, in this case, you will very likely need server-side rendering for your standalone components. I have not tried it out, but I guess it should work because everything is compatible in both directions. Saying this, the Angular team will also improve the server-side rendering story in one of the next releases, hopefully until summer. No promises, but if we read between the lines, one could come to the conclusion that until next summer we have a better SSR story.
Just one suggestion, Manfred. Would it be fine for you if we do the Q&A at the end again? So to not answer all the questions now, but proceed with the topics and then do another Q&A at the end, just in case someone needs to leave it at half or maybe to catch the rest of the content as well. But don't worry, we will answer the question definitely. Yeah.
I think that's a good idea. Let me quickly go through. Yeah, I think I've already answered most of them. No performance advantages, no. Okay. Just one, then we are done. Have you had providers from browser module have already been loaded? Error. No, I haven't had this, but feel free to drop me an example and I'm happy to look over it. Okay, cool. Yeah, so shamelessly, I took a lot of more time than expected. We discussed it yesterday in the evening. I told my colleagues, well, I think I will take 35 minutes. And yeah, now it was a quite large 35 minutes time slot. So I'm sorry for this. I will do better in the future. And so I would say let's directly start over with Rainer again.
Yes.
Rainer, can you share your screen?
I can share my screen, yes, but I think I will start first without screen sharing, but let me just try if it's working. So you can see this redundancy, or what do you see?
I can see it, and just tell me when I shall activate it.
Okay, now if I just click on stop sharing, then you just see us again. Okay, good. Then I would just say I start right away. I don't think I will require an hour or so, maybe just 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah, but let's see. Good.
Sorry.
So before I start with the screen sharing, I'd like to maybe give you a connection to this topic. So this is about the NgOptimizedImage directive. And back in the old days when I was developing Angular applications, there was one application that was also kind of obviously on the internet. And of course, with Angular, you have a lot of issues in terms of CEO. You need to make sure that your bundle size is as small as possible and all that stuff. And what I think is that most of the underestimated performance improvements is that you can win with images. So what we had is that we were fighting for every kilobyte that was out there. And we even discussed things like, do we actually require the reactive forms module? Because on our homepage, landing page, we only had one input field, and maybe we can also drop the module for that. And so quite some heavy stuff already. And as I said, we've spent really a lot of time in making our bundle size as small as possible. And one time, I think it was on a weekend, I opened the live website, and I saw that for some reason the complete loading amount which was required was about 4 megabytes, and I was scared. I thought, what's going on? Did we include moment shares again, or what has just happened? And it turned out that somebody from the editors team, they've uploaded a header image which had the size of 2.5 megabyte, so way too large actually. Normally we had only 400 kilobyte, and this is, of course, what I mean by underestimating the power that you have when you make sure that that your images are also optimized, because most of the time, especially with this heavy image-based applications, you have a lot of images available, and they occupy most of your I don't want to say bundle size, but of the complete data loading that you need to do. And the NgOptimized image that I'm going to show you now was exactly made for this purpose. It tries to help you. It gives you some best practices and make sure that you are dealing with images in a very performant or in the best way. So now I think it's time to share my screen again. Share screen. Yeah, there it is. So I have already prepared an application, and when it's about image optimization, then of course I need to have a lot of images there. So this is it. So you can scroll down, and then you see here a list of all different and also very large images. So if we take here a look at our network, we see that we take about, where do we have it? 10 megabyte, which is of course quite a lot. The images, they are not optimized or anything, but just keep in mind for now, 10 megabyte. And going back to our example, to the source code itself, we see it's actually very done in a simple way. So I have here a normal div where I'm iterating over my images. Then I add the image or the image URL, and then I have here my header, which represents the title of the city or whatever. And what we can do now is that we can apply this NgOptimized image directive. And this can be done very easily. Everything which is required is that we have to change source to ng source, just like that. NgOptimized image is a directive, so we also need to import it. It's a standalone directive already. And I have already IntelliJ, so I have already this feature with automated imports. I just say, yeah, I want to import this NgOptimized image, and that's it. For the start, at least. I don't have anything else to do. Now, if I go back and the page reloads, we see nothing except a very nice error message. And what the error message now is telling us, it says, hey, look, I'm running now. So this NgOptimized, this directive is running now, and it has analyzed the image tags, and it says, look, you are missing the width and the height attribute. That one is required, it is necessary, because you have, otherwise, if you don't set them, you have content layout shifting. So this means when your browser starts to load your application, your page, your component, and the image comes afterwards, then of course the layout shifts all the time because the browser can't occupy the space for the image. And this is very bad for your performance metrics that are used here, of course. And that's why, because it's such a critical issue, it comes with an error so that I really see I have to do something about it. So the first step for me would be that I am applying my width and the height. So you can see here, well, it's full HD. So I have here 2920 and 2080. And then we see it's now a little bit better. There is still some warning message there, but at least we see something. Now, this is the way how the image how the NgOptimized image behaved already in Angular version 14.2. So since version 14.2, we had it already. And It became, of course, also stable with Angular 15, but this was already something that so there was no real change in from version 14 to 15 now. The new features will come later. But what we see here is that we can also apply now a new feature for this particular aspect when it comes to setting the dimensions. And when we don't know what dimensions our images will have, then we can also say fill. This is a new attribute we can apply here. And if we go back, then in this case, it doesn't really work, because how the fill, or what the fill wants to do, it looks at the parent component, it tries to find out the height and the width of the parent component, and then it tries to fill the images with these dimensions. Unfortunately for me, I have chosen to go with the relative parent element here. And the thing now is that the diff doesn't contain anything, if I can find it. So we see here that the width is there, but the height is 0, and that's why we don't see here anything. So be careful with the fill attribute. It might be possible in, I guess, in most cases when you're not using the relative attribute. But for my case, I say, yeah, I know the dimensions and I just set them. So this was the first thing. If I use the wrong dimension, I'm also getting a warning. So if I would, for example, say I have 1000 and not 1080, then I will get the warning telling me, yeah, I have analyzed the image. I saw that you have passed the wrong ratio, more or less. Maybe you wanna change and fix that. And of course, this is also quite helpful. So I can go back and let's say here, okay, now it's this. Next warning. What we see here is that now it complains and says, hey, look, this Wien or Vienna image that you see here just right in front of us, it looks like this is the largest contentful paint that you have. So this is the biggest element, so to say. And usually we want, of course, to make sure that the largest things, that the loading for them starts as early as possible. And with images, we actually have the possibility to tell our browser, hey, look, please load this image first of all, and then maybe load the others, because this is the one that all the users see at the very beginning. I've missed one thing to tell you before I show you how we can deal with this prioritization. Just by applying the ng source attribute, all the images, they have now become lazily loaded, or they are now lazy loaded. If you remember, in the beginning, when we loaded the application, all the images were loaded. So we were beyond 10 megabytes. Now we only get the first 3 of them. So the browser is aware of that, or there was some change somehow, because if I scroll down, we see that the images are, of course, then also loaded. And this is this lazy loading feature. Where does it come from? Well, obviously it comes from this directive already. Because if I click on the image tag here, then we see that by default, they have the loading set to lazy, fetch priority to auto. And this is something that I didn't do manually, but it's something that my directive did. But of course, it's complaining now and says, yeah, now you've set everything to lazy loading. At least make sure that the first one, which is visible for everybody, is prioritized. And the way how I can do this here in my example is that I say, well, it's actually the first one. So I can say, okay, first as is first, because the ng4 gives me this information, of course. And then I can say here, there is this priority tag, where I can say, yeah, only if it is really the first, then I want to set this to true. And if I do this, then the warning goes away, as we see. And if I take a look at the element, then we also see that the first one has now loading set to eager and fetch priority to high. And all the other ones, they are still continuing to be lazily loaded. So this is already the first more or less major improvement that we have. Good. And then, as I said before, in 14.2, this was already kind of the functionality that it provided. And then with 15, it introduced new functions when you use a dedicated image loader. Also in 14.2, you had already the possibility to come up with an image loader, which means you can kind of come up with a function that says, I am loading these images not from my assets folder, but I want you to go to a CDN and load it from there. And at the moment, Angular or this directive supports 4 different CDNs, and the one that I using here, or that I used here, is Cloudinary. So Cloudinary is something which can do this. Let's quickly check. So the way how it works, that you need to upload your images first. I have here my media library, and you see here there is already a folder Angular 15. And if I click on that folder, then we see here all these images. And what I want to do now is that I want to tell Angular, hey, look, you have the images in Cloudinary as well. They will probably come up with some better network possibilities that I can provide. Please use them. And the way how it works, that I need to use now an image loader, which comes as an own provider. Exactly what Manfred has shown before with these new provide style functions. I can also embed that one here. So the way how it works is that I say, yeah, I have now providers. So I do it only for this component. And I say here, provide Cloudinary loader. Don't even know what the others are. Here we are. So we have Cloudflare, EMG-IX, and ImageKit loader, but I stick to Cloudinary. And then you need to provide your URL that you have, like this. And then it should hopefully work. The only thing, so let me quickly check, going back to our application, we don't see anything because it's the wrong path, right? So I need to say here, it's not coming from assets anymore, but Angular 15. And as you see, now the images are showing because Angular now can deal with it. So far, so good. So again, this is what we had already in 15.2, but now we get something additional. Because if you take a look at the images at the moment, you see that it also comes with a source set. And this only comes because we are using here an image loader. Now with source set, we can provide different variations, different sizes of the same image. So when we are maybe, so in our case, what you see here is the default setting, which means we are providing the images for 2 pixel densities. So I say here, if you have just normal full HD, or if you have pixel density, so if you 4K, for example, then you can also use the image in a higher resolution. And this is what we have here. I'm running actually on a system where I have pixel density of 2, which means that I will always opt in for this here, for the large one. As I said, this is something I don't need to do. This is something that this image directive does already do for me automatically. It just tells the browser, look, there are 2 different images available. Just pick the right one. And with the connection to the Cloudinary, to the CDN, more or less, the CDNs can then resize the images on the fly. So if the images are available in a very high resolution, then of course they can provide it if necessary. Of course, on the other side, if our resolution of our screen or wherever we are, whatever we use to use our application, it will of course also reduce it down. But at the moment, it's just about pixel density. And now I can come up and can say, yeah, but maybe I want to provide the same image in different width, for example. And the way how it works, that I can just go to my image tag again, and I say ng source set. Okay, so I could theoretically just say I don't want to provide the high density screen image. I only want to provide one version. So in this case, you see already it just limited or just reduced it down to 1. But what else I can do is that I can say, okay, maybe I use 1.5 and the 2, so 3 different densities. And of course, if the images were uploaded in a very high resolution, then of course it would always also work. In my case, I think I've done a typo. Not really sorry. Yeah, image was kind of rendered, so it took a little bit some time. But the thing is, if we take a look now at the image source, we see 1, 1.5, and then also 2. You might have seen it before. As soon as I've switched on the CDN, Angular told me another thing. It said, hey, look, I see you are loading your images from a different domain, and you can improve this. You can improve this by adding here this pre-connect tag to your index.html, so that it also that the fetching can happen a little bit faster. So when I do this, I go there, go to my index.html, place it here, and then hopefully Angular is happy and this warning also goes away. Let's quickly check. Recompiling. Yeah, now it's gone away. What we also can do with this ng source set is that we can, for example, now say we want, or maybe we say, yeah, it's fine to provide the images in these 2 or in these for these 3 pixel densities. But what happens if somebody is using a mobile phone? What image should then be used? And for this use case, we also have the so-called the sizes attribute. And so I'm going to remove the ng source set, and I just say size. And the way how it works is that now I have to say how much of the viewport, how much in terms of percentage of the viewport this image will take. Which means if I say 100% of the viewport in this case, and I reload my page, then the images will change completely. So the image source set will change completely, because now, oops, that's not, doesn't look very right. Sizes, it's the plural. Now it's better. Now you see that Angular, for some reason, provides me with different width. So not the ones that I've defined before, but with quite a lot of them. They are all defined. They can be overridden with an injection token, but the default ones is what we see here. So we see now that Angular is requesting images in lower resolution modes. So for 640 pixels, for example, or also 1200, 750, whatever. The result of this is if I go to my network and I say for some reason I'm running now on a lower resolution, then please keep in mind that at the moment the Vienna image was loaded with almost 0.5 megabyte, which of course is completely unnecessary here in this case. So if I reload it, then we will see that now Vienna was loaded within 224, so almost a fourth of the original size, because we have this combination where Angular plays together with a CDN, providing all the image source sets, and the CDN is then just really providing the optimized image in the right resolution, and so that really the way or the images that they are really responded or that are delivered are done in a very efficient way. And of course, if I move on and say, okay, I want to increase the width here, then what you see is that a reloading of the images is happening. And this happens, of course, every time when I cross a breakpoint. So when in one of these width that we have seen before, when I come to such a threshold, then of course the browser automatically says, hey, I see that there is a better image available, and then it just loads that one. One last thing about this is the problem is that the browsers don't really know how large the images really are or how much space they occupy. This is why I also need to come up with this information in terms of the viewport. For example, if I say I want to in the large responsive mode, I want that the diff only occupies 50% of the screen or whatever I have here. Then we might think that, of course, now the browser is intelligent enough and says, okay, now this has just, how large is it? Layout. Oh, we don't see it here. Wonderful. It's just 620 pixels. So I'm not going to load all of it. But what happens in reality is that the browser, I need to reload it, that the browser takes the whole image. So the full one, in this case, the 4K version of it. Because again, the browser does not know that the image is just occupying 50%. The reason why the browser does not know this is because the browser needs to start the image before it starts to calculate the DOM in this case, or the CSS and what effects it might have to the image. And because of that, the browser needs help from us. So what we need to do now, it's actually what I've done before. I told the browser, hey, look, the image that you're going to load will occupy the complete width. Now it's different. Now I need to tell the browser, hey, it's only occupying half of the width, which means if I, let me quickly make it like this, quick check. It changes a little bit. If I say here, sizes is just 50, then the browser, of course, is again aware of it, but not now. Oh, it is already aware of it because now the image is a little bit smaller. It's now only full HD and not 4K anymore. Okay, so we always need to apply this. And as it is normally the case, we have some responsive websites ongoing. So it's not just that it occupies this 50% always, but maybe just one in the large area. And then we also have some possibility to tell this the browser. So if I say, for example, if I just reduce the width again, we see that it jumps back to 100% after, I think, 2025. So when this breakpoint is reached. And the way how we can tell this kind of behavior to the browser is that we can also come up here with multiple values. So I could, for example, say, starting with a min width of 20 with 1024 pixels, please go with half of the width, and otherwise by default just use the full width. Which means now, if I load my image again, then maybe I need to load it like this. Then we see here that Vienna takes again more or less, no, this is not the right way. It isn't as I wanted. Yeah, now it takes 2048. And if I now go to decrease it a little bit like this and reload it, then we should see a difference. We don't see a difference. Okay. Yeah, which is something I have to play a little bit with it. It's always about these dimensions here. Let me quickly, it should actually load it in a higher resolution. Yeah, now it's also the same. Yeah, okay, good. Then I think I'm not going to manage it now, but I just wanted to point out that this is here a way how you can also include responsive versions of your images. It's not that easy. It's a little bit complicated. Of course, you need to know in advance how much space it will occupy, but it's definitely possible because, again, with the combination of CDNs, you can really optimize the image resolution so that you don't deliver too small or too high resolution images, but always the best for your device. And that's more or less everything I have to say about the NgOptimizedImage directive. There's not so much more. So, are there any questions? How about switching to next-gen formats? So if Manfred is here, maybe you can kind of promote the questions to your screen, otherwise keep them loud. So from Stefan Schön.
Yeah, of course. We don't have that many questions.
There's just one, I think.
This one, yeah. Yeah.
Yes. How about switching to next-gen formats like WebP? Sure, this depends on, but does any? Yeah. So as far as I know, this Cloudinary that I'm using, I think they have already provided the newer ones. I think they will also find out what the browser supports and that stuff, and they really can generate the images more or less on the fly.
Awesome. Awesome. There is just another one that showed up.
Your Cloudinary. So that's the name. Cloudinary.
Cool. It's not an ordinary, but an Cloudinary city.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so if you have further questions, please write them into the chat and Rainer will be happy to answer them. I also already answered some of those questions in there. Oh, there's one more. Okay. Is there any advantage to use NgOptimize for a single image?
Yeah, in combination, I mean, first of all, you're getting all these best practices. So if you miss something like adding the dimensions, you're getting this warnings. You will also get an information if you have set the priority tag or the priority value on the right image, of course, because Angular is checking this dynamically on the fly. So it really checks, what image is in the viewport, identifies the largest contentful paint. And if that's not eagerly loading, then it will tell you. So even with a single image, this is possible. And of course, the best thing you can do is that you combine it with the CDN or you have your own one. In the case you have your own kind of server-side functions that can resize images on the fly, you need to implement your own image loader, but I think it's doable. It's not that hard. But because then you just get the optimized image format or image resolution to be correct. So it's definitely makes sense for a single image as well.
Awesome. Cool. Big thanks, Rainer. And yeah, as mentioned, if there are any other questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And in between, we are bringing Michael to the stage so that Michael can go on with his awesome talk. It's really a nice topic that really seamlessly fits to the things I told you before. It will make everything more lightweight and straightforward. So please, Michael, stage is yours.
Thanks a lot, Manfred. I prepared a little bit for you about host directives, about functional guards, and we can also look quickly at least into creating dynamic components that are actually replacing a normal DOM element. So you can even render components into normal DOM elements and replace them. The application I prepared is again our flight search engine. And at the moment, I can click now on this About screen here, and you can see a lazy component is loaded there. And basically, the piece of code that is doing that also holds an ngIf here. So this ngIf is actually deciding whether to show that lazy component or not. And basically, I can change this to my own custom directive if I like. So at the moment, I'm just importing a show directive, and this show directive has a selector or has an attribute that selects the directive, which is show. And then I'll save this and return to my screen again. And after a quick reload, it will still show my lazy component, but wait for a moment. Now it starts blinking, right? So showing it, hiding it, showing it, hiding it. Nothing very interesting maybe for a business application. Nevertheless, it shows that you can easily enhance the implementation of the ngIf structural directive with your own logic, that can even be reactive, that can even load some state, maybe out of the global state management, maybe out of a service. So let's look into that, because of course I did not want to implement this show directive with just re-implementing the ngIf, but instead I used the new host directive API. And the host directive API allows us to apply directives either on the host element of a component or chain together on top of other directives. That means we can reuse logic that was implemented maybe by a third-party vendor, maybe by the Angular team itself, like in the ngIf case, and I just place it like that. Host directives in the decorator, then I assign an array, and then I can either directly reference the directive that I would like to, where I would like to apply the logic actually automatically, or I can use this object syntax like that one that I've implemented here, because it has even more possibilities to configure that host directive API. In this case, I would like to set on top of the features of the ngIf, and per default, the ngIf, of course, offers some input and output decorators. And if I want to add those input and output decorators now to the public API of my directive here, so that everyone that is using my show directive is also allowed to set the ngIf value, or in my case, an alias. That means with this directive, I can now map everything that someone uses with property binding on my directive as a show equals something value with maybe a property binding. It will be added to the API of the ngIf as well. And now let's look what I implemented here. I implemented a setter method for the input decorator, and have a convenience method here to set the visibility. In the convenience method, I just use the ngIf directive. How do I get access to that? We can either do this via the constructor, or with the new inject method that I can call here. So with that, I have now access to my ngIf directive. And now I can use all the APIs that are available on the ngIf directive. In this case, I'm setting the visibility. So this is for just passing on the value. So to actually have the very same functionality like with the normal ngIf, I'm just passing a Boolean value visibility true or false to my structural directive. It internally uses the implementation of the ngIf directive, although I never mentioned ngIf anywhere here. So it reuses the logic here in my generic directive, but it adds on top of that also a simple asynchronous logic. So I just took a timer here and defined it that way that it should start 3 seconds after initialization, and then each and every 1.5 seconds it should actually emit a new value. And I'm just then checking whether it's an even or odd number, and with that in mind, I just switch true and false, and that's the blinking effect actually. And what else is shown here? I can also use the lifecycle hooks of my directive here. So I can automatically, of course, if the directive is added with the component and later on the component is destroyed, then also the directive is destroyed. Let's demonstrate this, because I put a console log here. So each time the directive gets destroyed, we should receive a console log. So I switch to home now, and as you can see, show directive destroyed. So this is also a powerful pattern. We can use the lifecycle hooks of our host directives to get reactive lifecycle APIs. I will show you another example later on. So it just demonstrates a simple functionality that adds additional logic to show and hide certain elements, and it's quite easy to apply that directive, right? So I just needed to use my lazy component here and exchange ngIf with the show component, just added as an input directive here. Be aware though, all the directives that you want to use via that host directives API, all the directives that you use inside there need to be implemented with the standalone API. So this was the first demonstration about directives, and another one will follow later on. But before we reach that point, let's quickly demonstrate on how to use guards for routing. So in this case, I have a routing definition here for flight booking, and this flight booking has a lazy loading implementation there. In the past, we needed to use different guards for those routes that just shall be activated, and the other category of routes that are using lazy loading. Since Angular 14.1, we can use a combined guard. It's called CanMatch, and this CanMatch guard actually can return a value true or false for either the activation, for both in combination actually, the lazy loading part, the can load, and the can activate in combination. So let's place a definition here, and we are now allowed to not only use classes as injectables for guards, but we can also use functional guards today. So let's just do this inline right now here. I have already prepared a simple auth service. It just holds a flag with true or false, so nothing more. Let's set it maybe to true at the beginning. And now use again the inject method and request via dependency injection my auth service and can directly access the property. And this could already be my whole implementation, right? So if I just need to check whether it's allowed by checking one of the properties from auth service, from global state management, from wherever, maybe this is already enough. Let's switch back to my running application. And now I'm on the home screen and navigate to the flight booking, and I'm allowed, so the path answers with, the guard answers with a true value, I'm allowed to navigate, to complete the navigation first step, lazy load the module, and then also activate the component. Next thing, I can turn this, of course, to false. I'm in the home screen again, a reload, and then let's see just some error messages here. Not that good. So what can we do instead? So if it is false, if I'm not allowed to navigate, in the past we often injected our router and used the router navigate method to actually navigate to a login screen or something like that. We can do so alike here in the implementation, but maybe still within a one-liner by using inject. Then I would like to access the router, and then I can use the method create URL tree, because the interface also allows me to return a URL tree, and I can use that method to just pass in a string. And let's say I would like, in this case, to navigate to the about message, to the about component, to the about segment actually here. So in case I'm not allowed to enter flight booking, then please redirect to about. So let's go back here. Let's go to the home route again. And then I click to the flights booking section. And again, I'm entering the about route. So quite simple, isn't it? Just a one-liner with an or here. Either this is true, or I would like to return my URL tree to navigate to about. If I switch now back my auth service to true, actually, again, I should be allowed to enter the route. Again, it works, and I'm allowed to enter the flight search. Fine, so this was quite a quick demonstration. So functional router guards are a really nice extension that reduces the amount of code that you need to write. Often it's even possible to put it into a one-liner. And then finally, I would like to demonstrate you how to add a component, or add dynamically a component to your view actually. So basically I prepared something here in the flight search. It's a simple internal method, add flight info, and flight info is actually a component that I prepared. So it's just a simple component showing you a title and a message. Here's the latest security information about your flight. And now I would like to add this down there underneath the flight, below the flight search actually. And how could we do so? I prepared this method here. First of all, we could get access to the application reference. The application reference is actually the root scope of your application, where we would like to connect this component to. Then I would also like to access the environment injector for configuration. Manfred already told you about that. It's the one for your environment scope, the previous module scope. So as we have no modules anymore, it's called environment injector, and it's basically above the injector nodes of the app component. It's then the environment area over there, either only the root scope, or if you have some lazy loading in place or created an environment injector manually, then You could even have more than the root scope, of course. And then finally, I have a host element here. And now look at that. I'm not using any view container reference or something like that anymore. So if it's mandatory for me to really connect into one DOM element, I can use normal JavaScript APIs as well. I'm not forced to, but it's an option. And just access my element by an ID, CSS ID, or HTML ID, actually. And then I have reference to my host element. I'm then just checking, is this could this host element be found? Is it not falsy? And if it is exactly that way, now I can use the new function create component. I pass in my flight info component, so not a custom element or something like that. It's really an Angular component, the one that we've seen before. And then I just pass in the host element and the environment injector. And the final step is application ref, attach view. So I add my dynamic component to the application reference, to the root scope of the rest of the application by just using component ref dot host view. But unfortunately, as we can see, there is no component rendered out here. So something is wrong, actually. And if we look at that source code, it may be already obvious. So I'm actually having a prepared DOM element here, but this DOM element is part of my view of this component, but I'm trying to access that DOM element in the constructor flow, actually, by calling this add flight info. It's actually too early. The view is not ready there. The DOM element is not present there. So I have an issue now, like we always have or often have. We need to get access to something via dependency injection. So I would prefer, at least, to call this method in the constructor directly, because then I can use the inject method, the new one. Actually, but I need to split this into two parts. On first hand, accessing application ref and environment injector. And then at a later point of time, as the view is ready, I would like to actually access the host element, because it's not there earlier. And now this is really not the best case, because I actually would like to stay with that logic. I would not like to split this into two distinct functions, calling one from the constructor, calling the other one later on after view init. So basically, how could we change this? And that's the point of time where I promised you to show you another host directive. And that one is simply called after view init directive. It does not do that much, just a tiny piece of code. It has an lifecycle hook definition here in the directive, actually, and basically can write at the correct point of time. So after the view was initialized, it will write an event to this public subject stream here. So basically, we can access it everywhere where we have access to that directive. And basically, that's the thing that we can now do inside our implementation, and it really shows the full power of different APIs that the Angular team introduced recently with Angular 14 or Angular 15. So basically, let's do it that way by just using the inject method again. So no need to do this in the constructor, no need to do this in a class property that I need to assign. I just would like to access my my directive. First of all, sorry, I need to add the host directive, of course, yeah. So host directives. And now I can use the shortcut syntax, so not the full object like we used before, but just place it here with after view init directive that way. And then next thing, I can just access this after view init directive. Where is it? After view init directive, and then we know we have this stream right now. I can subscribe to the stream. I implement an implementation block, a callback method here at that time when the view is initialized, and then I just need to move this into my subscribe call, and then let's see whether it already works. Now my flight info is here, right? So I picked the correct moment of time, but the nice thing is I now just needed to extend my method to access this lifecycle hook. So it presents us, shows us another very, very nice use case, because I guess a lot of us already were looking forward to introducing, to have this API introduced by the Angular team, actually, to have some reactive lifecycle hooks. And now we can do this with just a simple generic host directive. So basically, that's all from my side. I almost hit the point at 5 o'clock here in Central European time. So thanks for participating. And of course, if you have some questions, just reach out.
Awesome. Thanks for your talk, Michael. I really enjoyed it because, adding a component in a very dynamic way in the past was really a win, and you showed us a very nice use case for host directive, making this straightforward. So thanks for this and all the other goodness you've shown us. Okay, are there any remaining questions? I think we are slightly a bit over time, but feel free to ask your questions. I think there is one question for Rainer. Do I have to provide URLs for all single images?
Well, I guess this is about the source set. So, I mean, the image loader, as you've seen, that's the one that's generating all the different URLs. So if you use your own backend, then of course you need to implement your own image loader, because you need to know the convention that your backend knows that it now has to resize the image to that or the other dimension. So you don't have to provide the URLs, but your image loader needs to do this. If I understood the question correctly, of course. So, but I think it was about it.
If not, feel free to add another question to the chat.
Exactly.
This is a side question to what Michael did. Do you have to unsubscribe or complete the destroy $subject, or is it not necessary?
Actually, no, it's not necessary. If you have it just referenced in one of your other subscriptions and you end the stream with that, it's not necessary. Yeah. Already had some discussions with the reactive guys around on Twitter about that. Yeah. It's fine that way.
Okay, cool, great. Another one for Rainer. Do I have to know the width and height of every image?
No, if you don't know it, then you can just apply the fill attribute, but then Angular will check out the parent component, will find out its dimensions, and then it will fill in whatever the parent component has. And as you have seen before, it's not working in my version because the parent component had relative position. So it's not always working. And it's also marked as experimental or beta, this fill attribute. So it would be, yes, it would be good if you know the width and the height.
A lot of applause. So thanks to all of you. Another one for Michael, I guess. You added after view in it, directive to host directive on component. Could you have imported that in providers array?
Yeah, good question. Good question, because it's not that easy to get into at the beginning. Yes, some use cases you can do this with providers as well. If it comes to on destroy, for example, it definitely works with providers alike. But you do not have all the view-related lifecycle hooks in providers. So if you need them, then please go with the host directives. It's then available there. So in the past, with providers only, we could not access exactly the same lifecycle hook that I used right now with after viewing it, for example. Yeah.
Awesome.
And maybe also think of, if you're writing UI libraries, maybe your own lifecycle hook, like after view checked, but only the next one and not the follow-ups. So take one only, maybe, yeah. So all such interesting patterns can be implemented now quite easily.
Nice. Okay, like in an English pub, last round. There's one. Think responsive image URLs are auto-generated and provided by the CDN provider in context with ngSource on the image deck.
Yes. That's right. So if you have a CDN or a backend that can do this on the fly, then it's exactly as Stefan said it.
Then you just need the provider to tell Angular how this is requested, isn't it?
Yes. So you just need to tell Angular this is the CDN provider. Of course, you need to provide some kind of key that the CDN knows this is the image you are requesting. And then the image loader understands how the CDN provider needs to have the information about the changed image, and they talk to each other, or they make it in a way that you don't have to do anything else.
Cool. There's another one. Is it recommended to use the cloud service like Cloudinary for non-public images?
You don't have to ask me this. I'm sorry, I don't know so much what these services provide. Yeah, I mean, I have an opinion. What I always say is, if they provide or if they have a product for security, and you are maybe a company or a team which consists of 5 developers, then I would usually use their solution, because they have security experts in their team and they normally really know how to implement this. If I do this as a side project, I would be more afraid of my own implementation. So I always go with the CDN solutions in that case.
So that no compromising pictures are leaked. For instance, now we have Christmas, so we have a lot of Christmas parties and stuff happens there, rumor says.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I guess maybe one thing to add, like, I also am not an expert for Cloudinary, but Azure, for example, Microsoft Azure has quite some APIs where you can secure images and have some sessions that you can create and things like that. Yeah. So for non-public resources. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, we also got some additional compliments. So I thank you for joining. I thank both of you, Michael and Rainer, for being here and providing so many knowledge. It was really great to be one more time together with you in such a setting. And
Thanks.
Have a nice day, and let's see you around.
Have a nice evening. Bye. See you.
Bye.